Welcome, my dear family. Before we begin our spooky journey tonight, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with anyone who enjoys bedtime scares. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is, so leave a comment below and cheer me up a bit on YouTube. Now, relax, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's story. 1. I found a survey marker buried under a human skull. I've worked as a contract land surveyor for most of my adult life. If you tell people that at a party, they either think it sounds boring or peaceful, usually both. They picture open fields, a tripod, maybe a hard hat, maybe me doing math in the dirt while cows stare at me. That is not what a lot of the job is. A lot of it is driving 3 hours into nowhere, then hiking another 6 or 7 miles into land nobody has touched in decades. It's busted fences, steep ravines, old boundary disputes, abandoned easements, and woods so quiet they start to feel like a soundproof room. I've worked in Tennessee, Kentucky, Idaho, Montana. If somebody owns remote property and needs corners found or lines reestablished, there's a decent chance somebody like me gets sent out there. 3 years ago, I took a job in eastern Kentucky, out near the Daniel Boone National Forest. The parcel belonged to a family trying to sell timber rights, and the legal description was old enough to be annoying. There were supposed to be 4 original iron pins and 1 stone marker up along a ridge line. My job was to locate them, verify the corners, and tie them into modern coordinates. It was a solo contract, 2 days, maybe 3 if the terrain sucked. The terrain sucked. The old logging road that was supposed to get me within a mile of the site had washed out so badly I ended up parking at a locked gate and hiking in with more gear than I wanted to carry. I set camp in a small flat patch above a creek, maybe 100 yards off what had once been a trail. It was late November. No leaves left on the hardwoods, cold enough that your breath stayed visible after sunset. The kind of cold that made everything smell like wet bark and stone. The first day was normal enough. I found 1 bent iron pin near an old barbed wire fence swallowed by saplings. Found another corner marker half buried in moss beside a limestone outcrop. Logged both, flagged them, took my notes, and made it back to camp before dark. I heated up canned chili on a camp stove, listened to an SEC game on my phone until the signal died, and turned in around 10. At 2:11 a.m., I woke up because something hit my truck. Not hard, just once. A metallic thump. I lay in my tent, still zipped into my sleeping bag, listening so hard my ears hurt. At first I thought it had to be a branch, maybe wind. But there wasn't any wind. The woods were dead still. Then it happened again. Thunk. It came from downhill, where I'd parked the truck at the edge of the washed-out road, maybe 80 yards from camp. Not close enough for me to see from the tent. I had a pistol in my pack and a good flashlight, but I didn't move right away. I just listened. Nothing. After about a minute, I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped out into the cold. My flashlight cut through the trees in a pale tunnel. Steam came off the creek. Everything beyond the beam looked hollow and black. I called out, "Hey!" No answer. I kept the light on the truck as I walked down. It was a white Tacoma, mud-splattered, easy to pick out between the trees. Nothing looked wrong at first. Then I got closer and saw the dent. Something had struck the passenger side door hard enough to leave a shallow, round impression in the metal. At my feet, in the leaves, was a fist-sized rock. Not a branch, not a deer, a rock. I swept the flashlight around the woods and got that feeling I've only had a few times in my life, where your body knows you're being watched before your brain catches up. I didn't see anyone, but I didn't linger either. I grabbed the rock, tossed it into the bed of the truck, and went back uphill. I didn't sleep much after that. At first light, I tried to tell myself some local kid had come up the road messing around, even though that made no sense. The gate had been chained. The area was remote. Nobody had reason to be up there in freezing weather before dawn. Still, I had a job to finish. That morning, I headed for the ridge to locate the final markers. I was about 40 minutes from camp when I found the first weird thing. One of my pink survey ribbons was gone. I always tie flagging tape near points I've already checked, mostly so I don't waste time crossing the same ground twice. The day before, I had tied a strip of neon pink tape around a sapling beside the limestone outcrop. Now it was gone. Not fallen, not torn. Gone. I stood there looking around like the answer might be obvious, and that was when I noticed another strip of tape, about 30 yards deeper into the trees. It was mine. Same color, same cheap plastic ribbon from the same roll. Only I hadn't put it there. It hung from a dead branch at eye level, perfectly still. I stared at it longer than I'd like to admit. There's a certain kind of fear that doesn't hit all at once. It builds while your brain keeps trying to force normal explanations onto something that is no longer normal. Maybe I had tied it there and forgotten. Maybe the wind moved it. Maybe I was turned around. Then I looked down and saw a boot print in the soft ground beside the tree. Fresh, deep heel, lug pattern, bigger than mine. I remember my mouth going dry. I followed the print with my eyes and found another, then another, all leading uphill in the same direction I was headed. That should have been enough to make me leave. Instead, I kept going. Because I was stubborn, and because grown men with jobs do stupid things when they don't want to admit they're scared. About 20 minutes later, I reached what should have been the final corner. According to the old plat, the marker there wasn't iron. It was described as a stacked stone set at the chestnut stump. The chestnut stump was long gone, of course, but the ridge saddle matched. So did the line. I started probing the ground with my steel rod, looking for a rock under the leaves. I hit something almost immediately. Not stone, hollow. I scraped the leaves back with my boot and saw a patch of white curve through the dirt. For one stupid second, I thought it was a bucket. Then I saw the eye socket. It was a human skull, half buried face up in the earth. I stumbled back so fast I nearly fell. The top of it was caved in, cracked inward, packed with dirt and dead leaves. One side still had teeth. The jaw was missing. Just below it, pushed into the ground at an angle, was an old iron survey pin wrapped with rusted wire. I can't describe how wrong that looked, like somebody had used a human head to mark a property corner. The air seemed thinner all of a sudden. My chest got tight. I took 2 pictures with my phone on instinct, then lost signal trying to call 911. I backed away from the spot without taking my eyes off it. That was when I heard someone clear their throat behind me. close, maybe 15 feet. I turned so hard I felt something pull in my neck. There was a man standing between two bare hickories uphill from me. He looked to be in his 60s, maybe, but rough enough that it was hard to tell. Thin, dirty Carhartt jacket, gray beard down his throat, one eye cloudy white. He held a length of chain in one hand, like he'd just happened to be carrying it around the woods. He wasn't surprised to see me. That was the part I remember most. He just looked annoyed. "You found it," he said. I actually took a step back before I answered. "I'm calling the police." He nodded once like that was fair. "No signal up here." My hand tightened on the phone anyway. "Who is that?" He glanced toward the skull without looking bothered. "Man named Kepley,
Or that's what my daddy said. Been there longer than I've been alive." The chain in his hand clicked softly against itself as he moved. I noticed then there was something dark on his sleeve cuff. Old blood maybe. Mud maybe. I didn't want to know. I said, "Stay where you are." He gave me the faintest smile. "You surveyors always say that." I backed downhill. He didn't rush me, didn't threaten me. He just started walking parallel to me through the trees, matching my movement, always keeping the same distance. Every time I stopped, he stopped. Every time I moved, I heard that chain whisper through the brush. I got maybe 60 yards before I turned and just started going fast, half sliding down the ridge with gear banging against my side. Branches snapped behind me. I remember my boot hitting rotten wood and punching through. I remember nearly eating it on wet leaves. Mostly I remember that I could hear him now, no longer pacing me, actually coming after me. Not running, just coming. That was worse somehow. I made it back to camp breathing so hard I tasted copper. I threw my equipment in the truck bed without packing it properly, yanked the tent stakes free, left half my food there. My keys shook in my hands so badly I dropped them twice. When the engine finally turned over, I could have cried. I threw the truck in reverse and backed crooked through brush until I got aligned with the old road. I was reaching for the shifter when something hit the rear window. A face. For a split second, I thought he'd thrown himself against the glass. I shouted and slammed on the brake by instinct, then realized it wasn't a face attached to a body. It was a deer skull, fresh enough that stringy tissue still hung from the base. The antlers had been sawn off, blood and yellow fat smeared across the back glass before the skull slid down into the truck bed with a wet clatter. I jammed it into drive and punched the gas. The tires spun in the mud, caught. Then the truck lurched forward so violently my shoulder hit the door. Branches whipped both sides. Something struck the tailgate once, hard. Maybe that chain. Then I was down the washed-out road and not stopping for anything. I got enough signal about 20 minutes later to call the sheriff's office. I told them everything except how panicked I sounded. They met me at a gas station off a highway. 2 deputies took my statement. One of them drove back up with me and another unit. They found my abandoned camp. They found the disturbed ridge. They found the old iron pin. They did not find the skull. They did find blood in the leaves nearby, though not much, and drag marks leading off into a patch of mountain laurel too thick to follow easily before dark. The older deputy asked if I was sure I hadn't mistaken an animal's skull for something else. I showed him the pictures on my phone. That shut him up. 3 days later, they called to tell me they'd located a shallow grave on adjacent private land after cadaver dogs alerted near a collapsed root system. It held partial human remains, old enough that they needed dental comparison and whatever else they do. They also found, scattered nearby, several lengths of rusted chain, broken survey stakes, and a coffee can full of teeth. Human teeth. Not all from the same person. The man with the cloudy eye wasn't there. They found a shack farther down in a ravine, hidden under camouflage tarp and brush. It had canned food, traps, a wood stove, and pages torn from county plat books. There were names written in the margins, deed references, parcel numbers, dates. Several belonged to survey jobs done in that area over the years. One of those names belonged to a guy I'd worked with in West Virginia a decade earlier. He'd gone missing on a hunting trip and was never found. The sheriff never told me this next part directly. I heard it from a woman in the clerk's office months later when I went back for certified copies. The old family who once owned those ridge parcels had a son who disappeared in 1987 after being questioned about a missing trespasser. Then another man vanished in 1994. Then a logger in 2003. No charges ever stuck to anyone. Small places bury things when the right last names are involved. I quit remote solo work after that. Not immediately. Men tell themselves lies about what they can handle. I took easier jobs. Open land, construction staking, utility work, stuff near roads and people. But I stopped sleeping alone in the woods. Stopped trusting old boundary descriptions. Stopped walking toward flagging tape I didn't remember tying myself. The last thing that finally killed it for me happened 8 months later. I was cleaning out the Tacoma before selling it. Under the back seat, shoved so deep I must have missed it half a dozen times, was a strip of faded pink survey ribbon tied around something small. It was one human finger bone. Weathered, brown at one end, cleanly stripped. There was handwriting on the ribbon in black marker. Not much, just one line. Found your missing corner. I burned the ribbon in a metal bucket behind my garage. The bone didn't burn right. It blackened, cracked, and gave off a smell I still can't separate from cold air and wet leaves. I buried what was left in a shoebox at the edge of my property and didn't mark the spot. A year later, somebody dug it up. No tracks in the yard, no hole anywhere else, just the lid of the shoebox lying open in the grass and the bone gone. I sold the house 2 months after that. I didn't tell the buyers why. 2. The fire looked real until I saw what was hanging in the window. I used to guide late-season snowmobile and backcountry trips in western Montana. Most of my clients were exactly what you'd expect. Wealthy guys from Texas or Arizona who wanted a rugged winter story without understanding what winter in the Northern Rockies actually is. They'd show up in clean gear, expensive goggles and gloves too new to bend properly, then spend the first day learning the difference between cold and dangerous. The people who scared me least were the inexperienced tourists. The ones who scared me were the locals who acted casual. 6 winters ago, I agreed to take a private booking from a father and son out of Bozeman named Russ and Caleb Mercer. Russ was in his late 50s, ex-construction, broad as a refrigerator, and Caleb looked about 22. Nice enough at first. They said they'd done the route before,
wanted a guide mainly because of recent avalanche concerns in one section.
It was a 2-night run between old Forest Service cabins near the Idaho border. Weather looked stable when we left. That matters because people always ask why we didn't turn back sooner. The answer is that winter does not always announce when it's about to become a problem. Sometimes the sky is just gray a little too early, and the air gets that dry metallic taste. And then by the time you admit it's changing, you're committed. The first day went fine, nothing unusual. We covered good ground, got to the first cabin before dusk, cooked chili from packets and canned beans, told dumb stories, slept in our base layers with the stove ticking in the corner. The second day was where things broke. We were crossing a long open section above tree line when Caleb's machine fishtailed on crust and clipped a buried rock shelf. He didn't fly off dramatically like in a movie. It was uglier than that. Sudden, mechanical. 1 second he was there, and the next the sled rolled and pinned his left leg underneath. By the time Russ and I got the machine off him, I knew it was bad. The lower leg had a shape no leg should have. His snow pants were torn at the shin, and white bone had punched through fabric slick with blood. Caleb made one sound when we moved him. I still hear it sometimes in dreams. Not a scream, more like a wet choke from somewhere deep in the chest. We were at least 15 miles from the nearest cabin, and farther than that from anything resembling quick rescue. I carried a satellite messenger and an emergency locator, but coverage in those drainages could be hit or miss in heavy weather, and the clouds had already started coming down. I splinted the leg as best I could, loaded him with painkillers from the kit, wrapped him in spare insulation, and sent the distress call 3 times. No confirmation came back. Russ wanted me to leave immediately for the nearest cabin with the radio. I said I wasn't leaving his son alone with a storm rolling in. He looked at me, then at Caleb, then back at me and said, "You aren't. I am." That surprised me. He was older, slower, and not the better rider of the 3 of us. But he was also Caleb's father, and there are moments when arguing with a parent feels obscene. We got Caleb tucked into a half shelter dug against the lee side of a drift with a bivy sack and both our extra blankets. Russ took my spare GPS, I marked the cabin route, and he headed out on his machine into worsening visibility. I stayed with Caleb. For about an hour, maybe more, I kept him talking. Asked him stupid questions, favorite bands, where he went to school, whether the Broncos were ever going to matter again. He drifted in and out. Snow built up on the tarp edge. The wind got louder. Every so often I checked for lights or engine noise and saw nothing but white. After dark, I accepted what I'd been refusing to say out loud. Russ wasn't coming back soon. Either he'd made it and was waiting on rescue, or he was lost too. Caleb's lips had gone pale. I knew if I stayed put much longer and rescue wasn't already moving, he might not make it. The locator still showed no confirmed send. I had one terrible option left. Get him to hard shelter somehow. About 2 miles downhill from our position, there was an old trapper structure marked on outdated maps. Not an official cabin, more like a ruin. I'd never relied on it before because people said it had collapsed years ago. But if any walls were still standing, it was better than a snow pit. I told Caleb we were moving. He was barely responsive, but when I started dragging him on the rescue tarp behind my sled, he came awake enough to beg me to stop.
Every bump sent pain through him so hard his body tried to curl despite the splint. It was hellish, slow, cruel. Snow needling sideways through my headlamp beam, the machine overheating from low-speed drag.
Me talking the whole time because silence felt like giving up. After maybe 40 minutes, I saw a light through the trees. Warm yellow, steady. I almost cried with relief. The structure that emerged out of the snow wasn't the ruin I expected. It was a squat cabin with a steep roofline. One side drifted nearly to the eaves, smoke coming from a stovepipe. The porch was half buried. A Coleman lantern glowed inside one front window. Someone was there. Someone meant heat, telephone, tools, help. I got Caleb onto the porch with every bit of strength I had left and started pounding on the door. No answer. I pounded harder. "Hey, we need help!" Nothing. I tried the knob. Unlocked. Inside, it was hot enough to make my face sting. There was a wood stove raging in the corner, a folding cot, shelves of canned food, snowshoes by the wall, a mug still steaming on the table. The room smelled like wood smoke, kerosene, and something sweeter underneath it, like meat left too long in a sink. "Hello?" I shouted. No response. I should have turned around right there and gone back out for Caleb. Instead, I took 3 steps in, looking for a radio. There was one on the counter, but when I picked it up, the cord had been cut. The sweet smell hit me stronger then. Rot under heat. I looked toward the front window because something about the lantern light had changed. A shape was moving there, shifting with the draft. At first I thought it was a curtain. It wasn't. It was a strip of skin. Long, pale, ragged at the edges. Something had been nailed across the inside top of the window frame and left hanging there like a decoration. It twisted slowly in the warm air, and for one impossible second, I could make out pores, tiny blonde hairs, a torn crescent where a nipple had been. I jerked back so hard the radio fell from my hand and hit the floor. The sound that followed came from above me, a single heavy thump from the loft, then another, then a dragging noise. I don't know why that's the moment my mind accepted where I was. Maybe because real fear doesn't arrive when you see the first bad thing. It arrives when all the bad things connect at once. The hot stove, the cut radio, the fresh mug, the smell, the hanging skin. Occupied, deliberately. I spun toward the door. A figure was standing outside the frosted glass panel, close enough that I could see the outline of shoulders. Tall, motionless. Then Caleb screamed. Not inside, outside, on the porch. I lunged for the door and yanked it open. The first thing I saw was blood sprayed across the snow. The second was Caleb halfway off the tarp, clawing weakly at the boards with one glove, while something behind the porch post jerked him backward by the hood of his coat. A man stepped out with him, huge, padded in filthy winter gear, face hidden behind an old snowmobile helmet with the visor ripped away. I saw teeth inside the dark opening where the visor should have been. Real teeth, smiling. He had one hand hooked in Caleb's hood, and in the other, he held a framing hammer dark to the claw. I went for my pistol. Too slow. Something crashed into me from the side and drove me into the doorframe so hard I saw sparks.
A second man, smaller than the first but fast, had come off the wall beside the cabin where I never saw him. We went down together on the porch. I lost the gun, heard it skid across wood. He smelled like urine and old grease. I remember that more clearly than his face. He tried to jam his thumb into my eye while I fought for his wrist. Somewhere behind us, Caleb was making this thin animal noise I will hear until I die. Then came the jump that still gets me when I think about it. The cabin door behind me burst open and a woman came out on all fours. Not metaphorically, actually on hands and knees like she'd been kept too long in a crawl space, barefoot in the snow.
Hair hacked short in patches. Her mouth opened and she shrieked loud enough to freeze everything for one split second, even the men. Her front teeth were gone. Blood ran from cracked skin around her lips. One of her wrists had a chain bolted around it, with a snapped length dragging behind her. She lunged past me toward the yard. The big man let go of Caleb and swung the hammer into the side of her head. The sound was wet and thick and final. She folded into the porch rail and slid down, leaving a smear so dark it looked black in the snow. That second of shock saved me. I got my knee under the smaller man, bucked him off, and threw myself across the boards for the pistol. My fingers hit it just as Caleb's father came roaring through the trees on the snowmobile, with the headlight bouncing wild between trunks. I have never, in my life, been so glad to hear an engine. Russ didn't stop. He drove the machine straight into the porch steps. The front skis smashed the railing, wood exploded, and the smaller man pitched sideways into the drift. I fired once at the big one in the helmet and missed. Russ was off the sled, screaming his son's name. The big man grabbed the woman's chain with one hand, like he meant to drag her body back inside, then thought better of it and bolted around the side of the cabin. Everything after that became fragments. Russ hauling Caleb upright, me covering the tree line with the pistol while shaking too hard to hit anything, the woman on the porch still twitching, once, then not at all, blood freezing in fans across the boards. We got Caleb and Russ onto the sled, and I rode doubled up hanging off the side, one arm around Caleb to keep him from falling, while Russ gunned us downhill toward where he'd managed to get a signal. Rescue met us after midnight, near a plowed service road. Caleb lived. Barely. They took his leg below the knee 2 days later, because the delay and cold had done too much damage. Russ had a concussion and a cracked rib from rolling his machine earlier in the storm. I had bruising, a separated shoulder, and frostbite on 2 fingertips because somewhere in the fight, I lost a glove. State police went out as soon as weather let them. They found the cabin. That part is real, documented. I know because I gave 3 statements and testified once. But by the time they reached it, the place had been burned from the inside out. The roof had collapsed. The porch was mostly gone. There were enough remains in the debris to confirm at least 2 adult males died there, likely from smoke and structural collapse, but the bodies were damaged badly enough that identification took time. They found shackles bolted into the loft beams, a hatch under the bed, human tissue in garbage bags packed with snow, teeth in a coffee tin, IDs from multiple states, a child's sneaker. They never found the woman's full identity. They believed she'd been held there for months, maybe longer. The official story that eventually made the news was narrow and sanitized. 2 reclusive brothers, possible kidnapping victims, violent confrontation during rescue emergency, cabin fire of unknown origin.
The part I never saw in any article was what hung in the surviving front window frame after the fire. Not the strip of skin. That burned. It was Caleb's trail map, pinned flat with finishing nails through all four corners. The route to both registered cabins had been circled in red marker. Dates were written beside them going back 6 winters. Some of those dates matched the same week every year. The week those cabins typically got booked by holiday writers who assumed official routes meant safety. I left guiding after that season. Couldn't do it anymore. Clients would ask why I changed careers, and I'd tell them I got tired of the cold.
That was easier than explaining why the smell of kerosene and wood smoke made me want to vomit. About a year after the trial, I received a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was one object: a visor from an old snowmobile helmet, cracked across the middle. Taped to it was a note written on the back of a motel receipt. "You left the fire burning." There were only ever supposed to be 2 brothers in that cabin. I never asked the police whether they were sure about that. I didn't want to hear the answer. 3. She chose the trail like she already knew where they were waiting.
This happened when I was 17, and I know exactly how that sounds. Every older person hears a story that starts with a teenage crush and mentally downgrades it. They assume hormones, drama, bad judgment, exaggeration. I probably would too. But I'm 34 now. I've had enough time and distance to separate embarrassment from memory. What happened in those woods was real. The girl at the center of it was named Mara Bell. She transferred into our high school in southern Ohio halfway through junior year. Not popular, not loud, not goth in the obvious hot topic way people would probably imagine. She was just hard to place. Pretty without trying. White blonde hair she hacked short herself. Gray eyes that made it seem like she was either bored with you or disappointed in you before you even spoke. Teachers didn't like her much because she smiled when they got mad. Not mockingly, more like privately.
Like she knew something irrelevant to the rest of us. I was obsessed with her almost immediately, which is humiliating to admit at my age, but true. I wrote stupid stories back then and thought quiet girls with unreadable faces were the most mysterious creatures on earth. Mara barely spoke in class, but once, during a fire drill, she stood beside me outside and asked what book I was carrying. Just like that. No preamble, no small talk. I answered like an idiot, and she nodded once and said, "You look like you get lost easy." Then she walked away. For 2 months, that was my favorite conversation of my life. I finally got her number at a bonfire after one of our football games. She was standing off by herself near the tree line, while everyone else drank warm beer and acted loud. I expected her to blow me off. Instead, she looked at me for about 3 seconds and said, "Do you hike?" I said yes. I didn't hike, not really. She told me to meet her Saturday morning at a gravel pull-off near Shawnee State Forest. No emojis, no flirting, just an address dropped in a text. My best friend Aaron told me not to go, not because he thought she was dangerous, because he thought she was weird, in the high school sense. Unpredictable, maybe mean, maybe setting me up to look stupid. I went anyway, because I was 17, and because being wanted by somebody strange feels better than being ignored by everybody safe. It was late October, cold, bright,
the sky washed clean after rain the night before. I borrowed my mom's Subaru, filled it with $10 of gas, chewed mint gum the whole drive so I wouldn't smell nervous. Mara was already there when I arrived, leaning against a faded green pickup I'd never seen before. She wasn't wearing anything dramatic. Flannel overshirt, thermal top, jeans, old hiking boots. No backpack. That should have registered.
I had a backpack with water, snacks, flashlight, cheap first aid kit. She had nothing. She got in my passenger seat without asking and said, "We're taking yours." Why? Because I don't want mine where we're going. I laughed like it was a joke. She didn't. So I parked where she told me, farther up a narrow forest road at a small, unmarked turnout with no trailhead sign, no maps, nothing official. Just a gap between trees and an old cable barrier cut years ago and left curled in the dirt like a dead snake. I remember saying, "This doesn't really look like a trail," and she said, "That's why nobody ruins it." For the first half hour, it was honestly great. She was more open than I'd ever seen her. Asked me about movies, music, whether I planned on leaving town after graduation. Her voice was low and calm, and every time she looked at me directly, I had to remind myself to keep walking like a normal person. The woods were beautiful in that Midwestern way people don't appreciate enough. Hollows full of leaf rot, pale sunlight through bare sycamores, creeks green with mossy rock. Then we came to a fork. Left path, narrow, descending into a darker cut between ridges. Right path, wider, climbing toward open hardwoods. Mara pointed left immediately. I asked, "You've been here before?" "No," she said, but she answered too fast. The left path got ugly quick, more overgrown, more blowdowns, mud under the leaves, a smell like stagnant water. I started noticing scraps of faded orange tape tied high in branches, not the kind park services use now, but old survey or hunting marker tape, sun-bleached, almost white. There were deer bones, too. At first one spine, then a rib cage, then a skull with the lower jaw missing. I made a joke about Blair Witch. Mara said, "People bring things out here." That was the first moment I felt the day slide away from normal. About 10 minutes later, she told me to go ahead because the trail narrowed and she wanted a cigarette. I didn't smoke and hated the smell, so that sounded fine. I walked maybe 30 yards before realizing I couldn't hear her behind me anymore. I turned around. Empty trail. I called her name. Nothing. I walked back to the last bend. No Mara. No cigarette smell. No footsteps. No sound but a woodpecker somewhere farther off. There wasn't anywhere for her to go. The hillside on one side was steep enough to slide, and the other side dropped into thick brush and rock. I called again, louder. Still nothing. At that point, I wasn't scared yet, just confused and irritated. I figured she was messing with me in some weird way. I pushed through the brush downhill a little, searching for any sign of her. That's when I saw the first structure. Not a house, more like a hunting blind built too large and too low, half hidden under camouflage netting and branches. It sat in a shallow depression between beech trees, maybe 40 yards off the trail. One wall was covered in old license plates nailed edge to edge. Beneath them hung what I first thought were carved sticks. They were finger bones strung on wire. I froze. Every instinct told me to back away quietly
and leave. Then a voice from behind me said, "Lose somebody?" I spun so fast I bit my tongue. A man stood maybe 10 feet away between two saplings. Tall, long brown coat, ball cap pulled low, clean shaven, which somehow made him look worse. Like this wasn't some mountain drifter stereotype my brain could package and dismiss. He looked normal enough to stand in line at a hardware store. He held a yellow length of rope looped over one shoulder. I said, "I'm looking for my friend." He nodded toward the blind. "Might be down there." Another voice called from farther right, "Pretty boy!" That one was laughing. I turned and saw a second man stepping over a log, heavyset.
Orange knit cap, black beard. He was holding a split piece of fence post like a club, not hiding it, just carrying it like we all understood what it was for. My body finally caught up to the danger before my thoughts did. I backed up and said, "I'm leaving." The clean-shaven man shrugged. "You can try." I ran. Not in any smart direction, just away. I tore uphill through brush, tripped over roots, slapped branches aside. I heard them coming after me almost immediately, not sprinting flat out, just moving fast enough to keep pressure on me. They knew the terrain. I didn't. That was obvious within seconds. I made it back to what I thought was the trail and found a different path entirely, narrower and clogged with laurel. My shin hit a hidden log and I went down hard on one knee. Before I got fully up, something snapped past my ear and smacked a tree, a thrown rock. I kept running. Another jump of pure terror hit when I burst through a stand of young pines and almost collided with a third person. For one glorious fraction of a second, I thought it was Mara. Wrong height, wrong build. It was a woman in a denim jacket, standing perfectly still with her head tilted, watching me approach like she'd been placed there. She looked maybe 40. Stringy hair, pale lips. One side of her face was deeply scarred, shiny and hairless from temple to jaw. In her hands, she held a Polaroid camera. She took my picture. The flash popped white in the trees. That sound broke something in me. I veered so hard, I nearly dislocated an ankle and crashed sideways down a leaf-covered slope. I slid through mud and roots and dead branches, then dropped into the bed of a dry creek. My palms were torn open, my mouth filled with dirt. Above me, I heard them moving parallel along the bank, not rushing, herding. That was the moment I understood I had not blundered into random creeps. I was where they wanted me. I followed the creek because it was the only direction that felt clear. The banks rose higher, turning the thing into a shallow trench. There were bones down there too, animal mostly. I told myself animal mostly. Then I saw the shoe. Small, white canvas, child-sized, still with part of a foot in it. Not fresh, leather brown and shrunk tight over bone. I gagged so hard I saw spots. A voice floated down from above, calm as a neighbor asking for a wrench. "Don't make it take all day." I looked up and saw the bearded man pacing me on the bank with the fence post over one shoulder. Behind him, through branches, stood Mara. That part still messes me up more than anything else. She wasn't tied up, wasn't crying, wasn't trying to get away. She was just standing there, watching. I shouted her name. I think I shouted why.
She didn't answer. The scarred woman appeared beside her and handed her the Polaroid.
Mara looked at the picture, then tucked it into her shirt pocket.
I ran again. The creek bent sharply and ended at a concrete culvert, half hidden in earth, probably old drainage from a logging road long erased by the woods. Rusted metal grating had once covered the opening, but somebody had torn most of it off. The pipe was big enough to crawl through. I didn't hesitate. I dove in. The smell inside was awful. Wet dirt, mildew, something dead. Total darkness after the first few feet. I scraped forward on elbows and knees with my flashlight clenched in one fist. Behind me, I heard voices, then laughter, then the scrape of something metal dragged across the pipe entrance. They weren't following. That was almost worse. My flashlight beam shook over mud, old beer cans, raccoon bones, graffiti sprayed in flaking paint. 20 feet in, the pipe widened into a storm chamber where runoff had undercut a pocket in the earth. That chamber was full of things. Blankets, coolers, water jugs,
Milk crates, hooks in the ceiling, a mattress so stained it looked burned. And on one wall, clipped to a clothesline with clothespins, were photographs. Dozens. Polaroids, glossy prints, drugstore 1 hours from years before. Men, women, teenagers, hikers, hunters, couples beside cars, people at trailheads, people smiling because they thought they were starting normal days. One photo showed me arriving at the gravel turnout that morning, still in the Subaru, one hand on the steering wheel, taken before I ever saw Mara. I heard a sound behind me and whipped the flashlight around. A hand shot through the dark and caught the front of my jacket. I screamed, full, humiliating animal panic, and smashed the flashlight down on it. The hand let go. A girl's voice cried out. I backed into the wall, beam shaking wild, and saw a face in the dirt at floor level to my right, where I hadn't noticed a side recess. A teenage girl, maybe 16, wedged behind stacked crates. Hair matted, lips split, one eye swollen nearly shut, chain around her ankle leading to an eye bolt set into concrete. She raised both hands immediately, terrified I'd hit her again. "Don't leave me," she whispered. That sentence has lived inside me for 17 years. I wish I could tell you I became heroic in that moment. I didn't. I was out of breath, half concussed from the slope, and hearing the others outside the pipe. Fear doesn't make you noble. It makes everything smaller. Your choices, your future, your soul. I crawled to the chain, searching for a lock. There wasn't one. The chain had been padlocked at some point, but now it was twisted together with fencing wire and hammered flat. Deliberate. Ugly. Permanent enough for panic. Outside, the bearded man called, "You find the room?" The clean-shaven one laughed. The girl started shaking so hard the chain rattled against concrete. I took out my pocket knife and went at the fencing wire. It barely dented it. My hands were slick with mud and blood from my palms. I kept sawing anyway. Then Mara's voice came from the pipe mouth, clear, close, familiar enough to make my whole body jolt. "You need to come out." I stopped moving. She said it again, softer. "You need to come out, right now." I remember looking at the chained girl and understanding two things at once. Mara had brought me here, and she was not fully one of them. Not calm enough, not steady enough.
I crawled toward the mouth until I could see daylight and her silhouette crouched there. She whispered, "There's another way up through the roots behind the chamber. If you stay, they'll flood it." I stared at her. "Why?" I asked. Her face tightened in a way I had never seen at school. Not cold, not smug. Miserable. "They took my brother last year," she whispered. "I bring them people, and they let me leave." Before I could answer, a hand grabbed the back of her jacket and ripped her out of view. She screamed once.
A real scream this time, high and sharp. Then a man's voice, furious now. "I told you not to talk to them."
The chained girl pointed behind me.
"Roots,"
she hissed. I found the gap half hidden by hanging tarp and debris. It was barely human-sized, a vertical break where tree roots had cracked the chamber wall and opened into packed soil leading upward. I tried to force the girl's chain through with her. No chance. Too short. She shoved at my shoulder. "Go!" I hate myself for what happened next, even though I know I would be dead otherwise. I went. I clawed up through dirt and roots while the flashlight tumbled away below. Something sharp tore my side. Cold air appeared above me in a seam of gray light, and I ripped through leaf litter into the open woods, gasping like I'd been buried alive. Voices below, shouting, the beginnings of water rushing somewhere. I ran downhill until I found an old service road.
A county worker in a pickup found me stumbling onto pavement nearly an hour later. Muddy, bleeding, incoherent. Police went back with dogs, deputies, state people, everybody.
They found the blind with the license plates. They found the culvert. They found the storm chamber. It was empty. No chained girl, no photos, no mattress, no coolers, no bodies. They did find blood in the pipe, though. Mine, mostly. And at the pipe entrance, they found one fresh Polaroid under wet leaves. It showed me inside the chamber, turned halfway toward the camera, my face white with terror. In the right side of the frame, almost hidden in shadow, was the chained girl, looking directly at whoever took the picture. That proved at least one thing. I had not imagined her. Mara never came back to school. Her house turned out to be a rental her mother had taken for less than 8 months. Gone overnight. Phone disconnected. No forwarding address.
The sheriff's office treated the whole thing like a near abduction by unknown transients, until the county found partial remains in a sinkhole 6 miles away 2 years later. By then, nobody could prove who had done what to whom. You know what bothers me most now? Not the men, not even the chamber. It's that Mara warned me at the end, which means she had enough heart left to save me, but not enough to save whoever was there before me. About 9 years after it happened, I was living in Columbus and sorting junk mail when I found a photo envelope with no stamp, hand-delivered, my name written on the front. Inside was a new Polaroid, a trailhead sign somewhere in winter, snow on the ground, empty parking lot. Leaning against the sign was a woman in a denim jacket, older now, scar down one side of her face, holding the camera out toward whoever was taking her picture. Next to her stood Mara. She looked older too, thinner, hollow in the face. But it was her. On the white strip beneath the photo, in the same black marker from years earlier, were 5 words. Still get lost easy? I moved out of that apartment the same week. I still don't hike if someone else picks the trail.
4. I found a locked deer camp. No one was supposed to still be using. I was 31 when this happened, old enough to know better and still dumb enough to think experience made me safe. Back then I did solo overnights a few times every fall in northern Pennsylvania, usually on public land where you could walk far enough in that the world stopped sounding human. No traffic, no distant highway hum, no barking dogs, just wind, black timber, and the occasional crack of a branch that made your body tense before your brain caught up. I liked that feeling more than I should have. My wife hated those trips. Not because she thought I'd get attacked by a bear or freeze to death. She hated them because, in her words, you always come back like you left part of yourself out there. At the time, I thought that sounded dramatic. Now I know she was right. It was mid-November. Rifle season hadn't opened yet, but enough hunters had already started setting up camps that you'd occasionally find an old fire ring, a stack of split wood under a tarp, or the smell of stale coffee hanging around a clearing. I'd taken Thursday and Friday off from work and driven up alone in my Tacoma from Maryland before sunrise, planning to hike in about 7 miles, camp one night by a creek, then loop back the next day. The weather report said low 30s overnight, maybe some sleet, nothing crazy. By noon, I was deep enough in the game lands that the trail stopped looking maintained. The blazes were faded, blowdowns forced detours. There were long stretches where I was basically navigating by contour and memory more than any actual path. I liked that too. It made me feel competent, useful. Around 3 that afternoon, the sky turned that flat, metallic gray that always means things are going to get uglier after dark.
I found the creek I'd marked on my topo map, but the ground around it was worse than I expected. Slick mud, exposed roots, and no really good flat area for a tent, unless I wanted to sleep with my head lower than my feet. I kept going, telling myself I'd find something better just past the next rise. That's the sort of decision that gets people hurt. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's ordinary. By 4:30, the woods were already darkening, and a hard sleet had started ticking through the branches. I cut uphill through a stand of hemlock, trying to get out of the drainage, and that was when I saw the camp. At first, I thought it was just a big pile of shadow between the trees. Then I made out straight lines. It was an old deer camp, single-story, block foundation, weathered plank siding gone nearly black with age. Not a proper cabin, more like a shack people had added to for 50 years without ever rebuilding correctly. The roofline sagged in the middle. One chimney was collapsed down to a jagged stump of brick. There was a screened porch on the front, half torn away. Behind it stood a rusted meat pole made from pipe and chain. I remember feeling relieved so fast it actually made me lightheaded. I wasn't planning to break into anyone's place. If there had been signs of recent use, I would have moved on. But from a distance, it looked abandoned. One window was boarded, another was cracked. The porch steps leaned sideways into the mud. I called out as I approached. "Hello?" Nothing. I tried again, louder. No generator, no voices, no radio inside, no dog barking, just sleet tapping on dead leaves and roof metal. The porch door hung open on one hinge. I stepped onto the boards and the whole structure groaned under my weight. Up close, the place smelled wrong. Wet wood, animal musk, old grease,
and something sweet under it all. Not food sweet, the kind of sweet that makes the back of your throat tighten.
The main door was shut, but not locked. The first thing I noticed when I went in was the heat. Not warmth, just that the inside was less cold than it should have been. The second thing I noticed was the smell was stronger inside. Mold, mouse droppings, damp wool, and underneath all of it, a coppery rot that reminded me immediately of blood left too long in a sink. I stood there with my flashlight up, letting the room form out of the dark. There were 2 cots, one against each wall, a wood stove, plastic gas cans, a card table covered in old beer cans, a busted lantern, and a fillet knife with a black handle. On the far wall hung deer skulls and one full-mounted buck head with one glass eye missing. Its empty socket was a dark hole rimmed with dust. The place wasn't abandoned. That realization came in pieces. There was ash in the stove that wasn't ancient, a jar of instant coffee on the counter with powder still clumped near the top, a pack of bologna in a cooler, a camouflage jacket hanging from a nail, still beaded with damp as if someone had worn it recently. I should have left right then. Instead, I did what people in bad stories always do. I rationalized. Probably somebody's seasonal camp, probably empty for the day. Probably better to wait out the sleet for an hour and then head on. I took my pack off, but kept my pistol on my hip. I always carried a sidearm out there, legal and more for comfort than anything. Looking back, it's embarrassing how much that little piece of steel made me think I had control. I sat on the cleaner of the 2 cots and listened. At first it was just the woods settling into evening. Then I heard a sound from the back room. A dull, irregular thump. I froze. It came again, not loud, more like something shifting and tapping wood. I called out, "Hey, sorry, I'm just getting out of the weather." No response. I got up, flashlight raised, and moved toward the narrow doorway leading deeper into the camp. The beam showed a short hall, a pantry on the left, and another room in the back with a stained mattress on the floor. The mattress looked like something from a prison cell. Thin, foam split open, yellow stuffing working out of the seams. Another thump. This time I pinpointed it. The pantry. I swung the light inside, shelves of canned beans, propane bottles, paper towels, jerky wrappers. A trap door in the floor, half concealed by a feed sack and an old shovel. The sound came from under that trap door. I just stood there, heart hitting so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Then something scraped across the underside of the wood. Slowly. Not an animal skitter, not claws. More like fingernails dragging, with no hurry at all. I backed into the hall so fast my shoulder cracked off the wall. "Who's down there?" Silence. Then, very quietly, from underneath me, "Don't let them know you heard me." The voice was human, male, hoarse, weak enough that for a second I thought maybe I imagined it. I dropped to one knee and shoved the feed sack away from the trap door. There was a hook latch screwed into the floor to keep it shut. From above, I stared at it and felt the skin on my arms pull tight. "Who's down there?" I whispered. A cough answered me, wet, ragged, deep in the chest. Then the voice again. "Please." I pulled the latch. The trapdoor stuck at first, then came up with a groan of damp wood and spilled a column of air so foul I gagged.
It hit me like a physical thing. Urine, old blood, mildew, and the unmistakable sickly sweet odor of infected flesh. Concrete steps led down into a cramped cellar. My flashlight beam found a man huddled against the wall in the corner. I thought he was old at first. He wasn't. He was maybe in his 40s, but starvation and filth had hollowed him into something much older. His beard was matted to his chest. His lips were split.
One side of his face was purple and swollen. His left ankle was locked into a short chain bolted to the wall. The skin around it was worn raw and blackened in places where metal had rubbed through and gone bad. What I first took for dirt on the floor wasn't dirt. It was dried blood, layered over concrete and tracked through with bare footprints. And bones. Not piles, not theatrical, just enough to make the room wrong. A deer jaw, raccoon ribs, what looked like finger bones in a coffee can near the wall. I remember telling myself they couldn't be human. I remember knowing I was lying to myself. The man squinted into the light and raised one hand like it hurt to do it. 2 fingernails were gone. His fingertips were chewed flat and shiny, either from him gnawing at the chain or trying to tear through something. "Are they here?" he asked. I said I didn't know. He wet his lips. They bled when he did it. "Then shut it. Shut it and listen." I should have gotten him out immediately. I know that. But fear does strange things to judgment. The room, the smell, the blood, the chain. My brain had gone from annoyance to concern to pure survival panic in about 20 seconds. And panic makes simple decisions feel complicated. I lowered the trapdoor most of the way, leaving it cracked. He told me there were 3 men who used the camp during season and sometimes outside season 2. He didn't know their names, only what they called each other. Dinny, Earl, Pastor. He laughed once when he said that last one, and the sound was so broken it didn't sound human. He said they picked people who wouldn't be missed quickly. Drifters, poachers, addicts, guys sleeping in cars near trailheads. Once, a kid who'd run from home. They used the cellar first to hold them. Sometimes they moved them somewhere else. Sometimes they didn't. I asked him how long he'd been there. He said, "Long enough I stopped asking what day it was." Then I heard the truck. Even through the sleet and the walls, I recognized it immediately. That low engine idle coming slow over mud. The man in the cellar flinched so hard the chain snapped taut. His eyes got huge. "They're back." The next 30 seconds come to me in flashes. My pack on the floor by the cot, boots on the porch boards, a truck door slamming, voices, male, joking, close. The cellar man whispering, "Please don't leave me." I closed the trap door because I didn't know what else to do and ran to the front room, trying to think. Too late to escape out the front. Too visible through the back. No signal on my phone. I drew my pistol and immediately understood how useless it was. One gun in a dark shack with multiple men outside and one of them maybe already on the porch. The front door opened. A huge man in orange bibs and a camo cap stepped inside carrying grocery bags. He saw me, stopped, and for one strange second we both just stared like 2 guys embarrassed to find the other there. Then his face changed. Not surprise, recognition. like I had become a problem he'd solved before. "Well," he said softly, "look what the weather brought in." Another man came in behind him, taller, narrow-faced, with gray in his beard and rain on his glasses. He looked past me once, taking inventory. Pack, bedroll, wet boots, solo. I aimed the pistol. The big man didn't even raise his hands, he smiled. "Careful with that," he said, "floor's slick." The third man entered last. He was older and broad across the shoulders, wearing a dark green slicker. He shut the door behind him very gently. There was dried blood in the seam of one cuff, old and brown. He looked at me like a butcher looks at an animal that's jumped the rail. "You hear anything downstairs?" he asked. No point lying with men like that. They can smell it. I fired at the lamp instead. Glass burst, kerosene flashed. Darkness swallowed the room, except for the fire crawling across the tabletop and the stove door's orange slit. I dove sideways, grabbed my pack strap, and hit the wall as somebody roared. A hand caught my jacket. I twisted loose so hard the zipper blew apart. The big man lunged in the dark, and I shot once without aiming. The muzzle flash burned the room into my eyes. Mounts on the wall, open mouths, teeth. The big man's face bright and furious 3 feet away. Then black again. I ran for the hall. I heard someone crash into the table behind me. Something heavy struck the wall where my head had been and buried itself in the boards with a thunk. Later, I would realize it was the black-handled fillet knife. I got to the pantry, ripped the trap door open, and yelled, "Move if you can!" The man below tried to rise and almost fell. I jumped down the first 4 steps, grabbed under his arm, and nearly dropped him from the smell and the feel of him. Fever hot, bones wrapped in skin, one pant leg glued dark to the calf with pus and blood. Behind us, the floorboards shook with footsteps. I fired upward once more. A scream answered, then a shotgun blast detonated through the pantry wall so loud my hearing vanished into a high, bright whine. Wood splinters sprayed the cellar. One piece sliced my cheek open. The chained man was fumbling at the bolt in the wall, yanking frantically. "It comes out," he rasped. "It comes out if you twist." I jammed my fingers onto the metal eye bolt and twisted until the rust screamed. For a second, nothing happened. Then the bolt tore loose from rotten concrete and dumped both of us backward. Light flooded the cellar opening. A silhouette filled it. "Don't," the older man said. He wasn't shouting. That was the worst part. He sounded almost tired. I shot at the silhouette, and he vanished backward. I dragged the chained man toward the far wall, where I finally saw there was another exit, an old storm hatch or coal door half hidden behind hanging plastic and shelves. They had painted the outline to match the wall, but from inside the seams were obvious. I slammed my shoulder into it. Once. Twice. On the third hit, the outer latch tore free and freezing sleet poured in. I shoved the man through first and crawled after him into black woods behind the camp. We slid downhill in mud and dead leaves, chain dragging and clanking against rock behind us like we were ringing a dinner bell. Someone came around the corner of the shack and fired. Dirt spat up near my hands. I hauled the man behind a fallen oak. He was trying to speak. Blood bubbled at one corner of his mouth. "What?" He grabbed my sleeve with shocking strength. "There's another one," he said. "Up the ridge. Buried." Then the big man hit the log from the other side. Not with a bullet. With his body.
The whole trunk jumped. A huge hand came over the top, grabbing for us. I fired twice through bark and flesh. He bellowed and disappeared. I started dragging the chained man again, uphill this time, blindly, just trying to reach thicker cover. We didn't make 50 yards. He collapsed hard and wouldn't get up. I knelt to haul him, and my hand slid under him into warmth. There was so much blood I thought at first it was mud. Then the flashlight, which I must have clipped back onto my chest strap without remembering, shook enough for me to see the color. His lower side was opened up. Not all the way, not movie style. Just enough that I could see dark, wet loops under shredded shirt and skin. He must have caught part of that shotgun blast in the cellar. He looked at me and knew from my face he was finished. "Don't let them put me back," he whispered. I heard the men moving through brush below us. I couldn't carry him. I knew it. He knew it.
I took the chain, wrapped it twice around a sapling, and jammed the loose bolt into the ground, so if they grabbed him, they'd have to stop and cut or unwind it. Stupid, maybe, but panic works with what it has. Then I shoved my spare mag and truck key under his hand, not because either would save him, but because leaving him empty-handed felt like murder. He laughed once through blood. "Go." So I went. I ran bent over, slipping, crashing through Laurel, expecting every second to feel hands on my back or steel in my kidneys. I heard them shouting to each other. Once I heard somebody yell, "He's heading roadward." That meant they knew the land better than I did. They probably knew exactly where I'd come in. Then I almost fell into the pit. It was maybe 6 feet long and 4 feet deep, crudely covered with branches and leaves that had sagged in the sleet. My right leg punched through and stopped me. Under the broken covering, my flashlight caught white shapes. Bones. A deer skull. A fox spine. 2 rubber boots. And lodged in the mud near one wall, half exposed, the round upper curve of a human skull, with dark hair still attached in patches. I made a sound I've never made before or since. I ripped my leg free and stumbled backward right into someone, an arm locked around my throat. The older man's voice went into my ear, calm and close. "Should have kept walking, son." I drove my thumb into his eye. He shrieked and loosened just enough for me to duck. We went down together in leaves and mud. I remember his breath, hot and rotten with chew tobacco. I remember the slick feel of his face under my hand, where the eye had been, not out, but damaged and wet. He bit the side of my palm so deep I still have the scar. Then headlights cut through the trees. A road. Not the one I'd parked on, but some logging track crossing the ridge. One of the men must have seen it too, because somebody below shouted, "Truck!" The older man turned his head for a split second, and I slammed my pistol into his temple until he rolled away. I broke out of the brush, screaming. The pickup on the road wasn't theirs. It was a county plow truck, blade up, creeping along to check washouts before the freeze. The driver later told me he thought I looked like a burn victim at first because my face was so cut up and one side was red with blood. I don't remember climbing into the truck. I remember trying to say, "There's a man chained up there," and vomiting instead. Police found the camp after dawn. By then it had been burning. Officially, they said a stove accident probably started it before they arrived. What they did recover was enough for arrests. Human remains in 2 locations, restraints, blood in the cellar,
and one of the men dead from a gunshot wound in the front room. The big one. The other two fled into the timber. One was caught 3 days later after he stole food from a farmhouse.
The older one wasn't found for almost 6 weeks. Winter drove him out eventually. The man from the cellar died before medevac reached him. I never learned his real name. The part that still wakes me up isn't the fire, or the pit, or the shotgun blast. It's this. About 8 months later, after the trials had started and I was back at work pretending to be normal again, a state detective came by my house because there was something he wanted me to identify. Not a weapon, not clothing. A photograph. It had been found nailed under a shelf in the camp pantry where officers missed it the first time. The photo was old, edges curled from damp. In it, the front room of the camp was lit by lantern glow. On the wall behind the cots were more trophy heads than when I'd seen it, and the porch screen outside looked intact, so the picture had been taken years earlier. At first I thought it showed only 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder. Then I realized one of them wasn't standing. In the lower right corner, mostly cut off by the frame, someone was kneeling on the floor with their hands bound behind them. The top of their head was bloody. Their face was turned just enough toward camera that the left side showed. It was the older man, not the kidnapper, younger by maybe 15 years, but him. Bound, bleeding, terrified. And behind the camera, reflected faintly in the one unbroken glass eye of the mounted buck on the wall, was the shape of another person, wearing the same dark green slicker he had on the night I met him. Meaning whoever trained those men there had stood in that room before them, maybe over them, maybe under the same roof, using the same cellar long before they became the ones holding the keys. I still hunt. I still go into woods, but never alone, and never if I see a meat pole standing where no camp should be. Because there are places in those forests that don't stay abandoned. They just change hands. 5. The fire tower had no way up to the window. I saw someone standing in. I used to tell people I wasn't scared of heights. That wasn't true. What I really wasn't scared of was machinery. I trusted ladders, catwalks, scaffolding, old utility stairs, anything made of steel and bolts. If a thing had been engineered, I believed I could understand it. And if I could understand it, I could trust it. That belief got stripped out of me in one night in Western Oregon. This happened in 2018. Back when I was doing freelance welding and taking stupid trips with my friend Nolan whenever work dried up. Nolan was the kind of guy who always had coordinates for something you weren't supposed to be around. Abandoned mills, closed service tunnels, empty ranger housing. If it existed on the edge of legality and common sense, he had a pin dropped on it. The tower was his idea. He found it in an old forestry forum. Decommissioned lookout, 8 miles off any maintained road, supposedly left standing because removal cost more than the state wanted to spend. He pitched it as one last dumb trip before he got married. Hike in, climb up, camp at the top, drink cheap bourbon, watch sunrise over the Cascades. We were both 30. And still trying to prove something to a version of ourselves that should have stayed 22. The approach was longer and worse than Nolan promised. Of course it was. We drove old logging roads for nearly 2 hours past locked gates and washouts until his Subaru physically couldn't go farther. From there we hiked uphill through fir and alder with full packs in drizzling mist, following old skid tracks and game trails
while gnats swarmed our faces and our boots slid in orange mud. We found the tower late enough that the sky was already beginning to lose color. It rose out of the trees all at once, enormous and wrong-looking.
Not romantic, not cinematic. Wrong.
The steel legs were braced with cross members, so rusted in spots they looked furry. The cabin at the top was square, wrapped in windows gone dark as old bottle glass. One side of the catwalk railing had peeled away and hung down in a twisted strip. The lower access ladder had no lockout cage anymore, just an open first flight of stairs leading into air. "Dude," Nolan said, grinning like a maniac, "tell me that isn't perfect." Perfect wasn't the word I'd have used. The whole structure gave off that feeling you get when you find an appliance humming in an empty house. Something built for use that should have been dead, but still seemed to be waiting. We walked a full circle around the base before climbing. There were old beer cans in the brush, some spray paint on the lower supports, one torn sleeping bag half buried in needles. Typical explorer trash, nothing that told me anybody had been there recently. What bothered me was the ground.
There was almost no undergrowth directly beneath the tower, just hard-packed dirt, rust flakes, and a weird, clean ring where pine needles should have collected, but hadn't. It looked too swept, too exposed. "Wind does that," Nolan said when I mentioned it. Maybe. But there was almost no debris trapped in the braces either. No bird nests. No hanging tatters of bark. For a tower that had supposedly sat unused for years, it looked disturbed in a way I couldn't name. We climbed anyway. The stairs were better than they looked until the last section, where the switchbacks ended and a vertical ladder ran up through a narrow cage to the trapdoor level. The steel was cold enough to numb my hands through gloves. By the time I hauled myself onto the top platform, my shoulders were shaking. The view should have made the climb worth it. Mountains in the distance, tree line going black in waves, clouds bruised purple by sunset. Instead, I felt the same thing I'd felt at the base, like we had entered the field of something that noticed. The cabin was unlocked. Inside, it had been gutted years ago. No radio gear, no desk, no cot. Just bare floor, windows on all sides, and water damage blackening the corners. The roof above had a circular stain where something had leaked for a long time. Across one wall, somebody had scratched dozens of vertical lines into the paint, grouped in clusters like a prisoner counting days. I assumed it was graffiti until I got close and saw the grooves were deep, chipped down to metal paneling underneath. Not keys either, too uneven, too heavy. Nolan found an old metal clipboard in one corner with no paper left attached, just rusted spring clips. He waved it around like he'd found treasure. I was more interested in the door latch. It worked, but there was a second locking bracket on the outside of the door frame that served no obvious purpose anymore. I pointed that out too. Nolan shrugged. Maybe for weather. Maybe. We set up on the catwalk instead of inside because the air in the cabin smelled like wet insulation and mouse nests. The mist thinned after dark, and for about half an hour, the whole thing became what we'd wanted it to be. Two idiots with a bottle, feet hanging over a 70-foot drop, stars opening overhead. Then, Nolan smacked his boot heel against the grating.
The sound rang out so violently through the tower that both of us jerked. It went down the structure and out into the woods in widening, metallic echoes. Not just loud, penetrating, like the whole forest had just been notified. I swore at him. He laughed, but not for long, because less than a minute later, a light came on in the trees. Far down the slope, white, steady, low to the ground. We both saw it at the same time and went still. At first I assumed flashlight. Then I assumed headlamp. Then I watched it for maybe 10 seconds and stopped assuming anything. It wasn't bouncing with steps.
It wasn't weaving around trunks the way a person picks their way uphill in dark woods. It moved in a smooth, level line, as if it knew the terrain better than sight required. Nolan whispered, "Tell me that's a trail." There was no trail there. The light kept coming. We didn't talk for a while. We just watched it travel through the forest without once swinging or dipping. Then, in a gap between trees, it did something I still can't make my mind accept. It surged, not sped up gradually, surged. One clean, impossible skip forward, covering maybe 20 feet in a blink, then resumed the same slow approach as if nothing strange had happened. The back of my neck turned cold. Nolan stood. "Okay, that's enough. What are you doing?" Seeing if it's people. Before I could stop him, he shouted, "Hey!" The word fell into the dark and came back in fragments from the hills. The light stopped directly beneath us. That made things worse, not because it answered, because it obeyed. We leaned over the railing, trying to see who or what had stopped at the base of the tower, but the angle was wrong. All we could see was the light itself, shining up through grating and braces, turning the underside of the platform into a cage of pale bars. Nolan called down again. No answer. He got angry, the way scared men sometimes do. He grabbed his flashlight and shined it straight through the grating, sweeping the base. Nothing. No figure, no shoulders, no face lifting to glare at us. Just dirt, cross-bracing, and that one white source blooming too bright to look at directly. "There's no one there," he said. I remember saying, "Then what's the light attached to?" He didn't answer. Eventually, the light clicked off, not dimmed, off. We stared into blackness so complete it made my eyes hurt. I wanted to climb down immediately while there was still some adrenaline in my legs, but the thought of descending toward where that thing had been felt insane. Nolan wanted to wait it out till first light. We argued in whispers for maybe 5 minutes, then both pretended the decision had been mutual. Inside the cabin, every window felt like a vulnerability. We set our packs against the door and sat on the floor with our backs to opposite walls so we could watch multiple panes at once. Nolan kept the flashlight in his lap. I had a fixed blade knife I suddenly hated for how little it would matter. The first noise came from below, a single metallic strike, hard enough to vibrate up the tower legs and into the floor beneath us. Then another, somewhere else. Then a drawn-out scraping sound, metal against metal, not random, not wind, like someone dragging a tool across a beam with deliberate pressure. I know what steel sounds like under stress. I know what rusted bolts sound like when they shift. This wasn't that. These were contact noises, intentional ones. Nolan mouthed, "What the hell?" I had no answer. The sounds moved. That's what got me. Not upward exactly. Around. different supports, different angles, circling. Once we heard a sharp, rattling series of impacts directly beneath the trapdoor ladder section, followed by 3 slow knocks spaced so evenly that my body recognized the pattern before my mind did. Not random. Communication. We didn't speak after that. Time stretched. At some point, the temperature dropped enough that I could see our breath when the flashlight crossed the air. I checked my phone, and there was no signal, no GPS lock, nothing but 1:13 a.m. on the screen. Then Nolan's face changed. He was looking over my shoulder. I turned. There was someone outside the window. Not close enough for details, just a dark, vertical shape crossing from one pane to the next on the catwalk outside. I yelled and scrambled backwards so violently I cracked my head against the wall.
Nolan lunged for the door, and we both hit it at once, shoulders braced, as if whatever had passed the glass was about to come through. Nothing did. We waited, shaking, staring. No footsteps on the metal grate outside, no hand on the knob, no shadow under the threshold. And that was impossible, because if a person had walked past that window on the catwalk, we should have heard the platform flex and ring under their weight. We heard nothing at all. Nolan whispered, "You saw it too." I nodded. He swallowed hard. How'd it get up here? I think some part of me still tried to stay rational. I said maybe it had climbed quietly. Maybe we were hearing too much other noise to notice. But then another problem forced itself in. The section of catwalk outside that window ended at a corner where the railing had long ago torn free and collapsed. There was no intact walkway continuing along that wall. If a man had crossed that pane from left to right, he had either walked through open air beyond the missing railing, or come from the side of the tower where there was no exterior access at all. We spent the next several hours pressed against that door. No heroics, no investigation, just animal fear. Every so often the tower would sing with another impact below. Once, something heavy thudded against the underside of the cabin floor, directly under us, hard enough to shiver dust from the ceiling seam. Nolan made a sound in his throat I'd never heard from him before. Just before dawn, the noises stopped. Not faded, stopped. The silence after them was almost worse. When there was enough gray light to separate the trees from the sky, Nolan counted to 3 and yanked the door open, while I stood beside him with the flashlight and knife like a joke version of being prepared. The catwalk was empty, wet, rusted, empty. No footprints, no dropped gear, no sign of anyone. We moved fast after that, packing without discussion. The plan was obvious. Get down, get out. Never talk ourselves into a second look. The staircase descent felt exposed in a way climbing hadn't. Every landing seemed like a place something could be waiting below. We got maybe 2/3 of the way down before Nolan stopped so suddenly I nearly walked into him. He was staring. An entire flight of stairs was gone. Not one tread, not a broken corner. The whole section between one landing and the next had been removed cleanly, leaving open space and 4 jagged bolt stubs. I felt sick so fast I had to grip the rail. The sounds in the night, the strikes, the grinding. Someone, or something, had been taking the tower apart while we sat above it. Nolan said no. Not loud, not disbelief, more like a child speaking to a nightmare.
We looked down to the dirt below, expecting the missing steel section to be lying there. It wasn't. Nothing was. We were trapped until we jumped it.
It wasn't a giant gap, maybe 5 feet across and 6 or 7 down to the next landing. Manageable on fresh legs in daylight. A terrible idea after no sleep on wet, rusted steel. I went first because Nolan had started shaking. I tossed my pack, grabbed the side rail, stepped onto the last intact tread, and jumped. My boots slammed metal and slid, but I held on. The landing screamed beneath me. I turned to spot Nolan. He tossed his pack. It landed, bounced once, and skidded toward the open side. I grabbed it just before it went over. Nolan crouched to jump, and something hit the underside of the landing he was standing on. A booming clang. Metal jumped under his feet. He yelled and almost went over backward. I looked down between the treads instinctively, and for one fraction of a second, I saw a face under the staircase. Not a full face, more like a head tilted upward from between beams where no body could have fit. Pale forehead, eyes reflecting gray morning, mouth too open, teeth black with blood or rot. Then it was gone. Nolan jumped. He made it, but not cleanly. His ankle rolled and I heard the pop. He screamed and collapsed against the rail. I grabbed under his arms and half dragged him down the next set of stairs while he swore and panted through clenched teeth. When we hit the ground, I looked back up. The tower cabin windows were black again. Except one. In the eastern-facing pane, where sunrise was just beginning to stain the glass, somebody was standing inside, perfectly still, too high to distinguish features, just a tall shape in the center of the room we had emptied not 60 seconds earlier. Nolan followed my stare, went white, and said, "Run." So we did. I wish I could tell you we found ranger stations, filed reports, got clean answers. That's not how it went. We got back to the car after 3 miserable hours of half carrying Nolan downhill. His ankle was broken in 2 places. He threw up twice from pain.
We left gear behind. We never went back for it. At a hospital in Eugene, we told a watered-down version. Old tower, bad fall, missing stair section, maybe vandals. Enough truth to explain the injury, not enough to make ourselves sound insane. Nolan didn't want law enforcement involved because he'd accessed the property illegally. I didn't push it because I was still telling myself every impossible part had to have an explanation. 3 months later, Nolan mailed me a padded envelope with no note. Inside was the metal clipboard he'd picked up in the tower. He said in a text that it had fallen out from under the passenger seat while he was vacuuming his car, and he never wanted to see it again. There was something tucked behind the rusted clip. A photo. Black and white, old enough the paper had started to silver at the edges. It showed the tower from ground level, probably decades earlier when it was operational. The stairs were intact. The catwalk railings were whole. There were 3 people standing at the base, all in forestry uniforms. And in the top window of the cabin, above them, was a 4th figure, not looking out, pressed against the inside of the glass, hands spread flat, face smashed so hard to the pane it had flattened the nose. On the back of the photo, in pencil so faded I had to tilt it to light, somebody had written, "Do not let it signal from the windows." I called Nolan immediately. He didn't answer. When he finally texted back 2 days later, it was just 6 words.
There was no clipboard in there. I still have the photo in a lockbox in my garage. I've thought about burning it more than once. What stops me is simple. A year after that trip, I woke up at 2:11 in the morning to a faint metallic ringing outside my house. My wife was asleep beside me. Rain was ticking off the gutters. I went to the upstairs hallway window and looked down at the side yard.
Leaning against the fence, standing upright in wet grass, where I know for a fact there had been nothing the night before, was one rusted steel stair tread with 4 broken bolt holes on its mounting plate. And wired through one of the holes was Nolan's wedding band. He'd been missing for 9 days by then.
6.
Something in Daniel Boone took my things before it decided to show me what else it had taken.
I still camp, which surprises people whenever I tell this story. What I don't do anymore is sleep on the ground in eastern Kentucky, not because I think there's a monster behind every oak, not because I believe every strange noise in the woods means something unnatural. I stopped because one specific stretch of forest taught me there are things out there that don't need to be supernatural to feel impossible. This happened 2 years after my divorce, when I was living alone outside Lexington and taking too many long drives just to avoid sitting in my own house. Work was bad, sleep was worse, and I'd gotten into the habit of disappearing into Daniel Boone National Forest whenever my head felt too loud. I knew some of those trail systems well enough to navigate them in fog. That familiarity was probably the reason I survived. It also may have been the reason I got picked.
I went in on a Thursday in late October. 3 nights planned. Truck at a trailhead off a Forest Service road. Tent, water filter, food, .308 rifle, sidearm, normal gear. Cold enough after dark to make campfires feel necessary, but not yet winter hard. The first day was uneventful in a way I needed. 7 miles in, mostly ridge walking, then down into a creek drainage where I set my tent on a shelf above the water under a stand of beech trees. I cooked chili from a pouch, drank 1 beer, and sat by the fire until the wood settled into red coals. I went to sleep around 10. At some point, deep in the night, I woke up for no reason. Not startled, just awake. You know how sometimes your body registers a change before your mind does? That was it. I lay there in my bag, staring at the fabric over me, and felt that something in the night had shifted. Then I noticed the color. A low orange glow was moving through the tent wall. I unzipped the flap and looked out. Through the trees, maybe 200 yards off, there was a fire. Small, campfire size. Shielded by terrain enough that I could only see the flicker and occasional tongue of flame. I listened for voices, laughter, clatter of gear. Nothing. The longer I watched, the less I liked it. Not because another camper was nearby, but because the firelight seemed wrong somehow. Too consistent, too steady between flickers. Like it wasn't reflecting off anything around it, just burning in its own little pocket of dark. After about 5 minutes, I convinced myself I was being dramatic. Somebody else had found a site off trail, that was all. I zipped the tent shut and eventually drifted back off. In the morning, I went looking for it. Call it curiosity, call it ego. I liked knowing who else was in my woods. I found the clearing I was sure I'd been looking at from camp. Distance, angle, slope all matched. But there was no fire ring, no ash, no scorched leaves, no boot prints, no food wrappers, no cut branches. The ground was so undisturbed,
It looked like no human being had entered that opening in months. I stood there a long time, with the morning cold in my nose and that first little thread of unease winding up inside me. Then I moved on. That was mistake number 1. By late afternoon, I had climbed out of the creek bottom and into older forest, where the trunks rose straight and tall, and the understory thinned into long, dark sight lines between trees. It was beautiful country, quiet in a way that can either calm you or put your nerves on edge, depending on what kind of thoughts you brought in with you. I found a decent campsite on a ridge saddle and set up early. No fire that night. I didn't feel like it. I ate cold trail food, listened to squirrels rustling in leaves, and got into the tent a little after 9. Sometime well after midnight, a sound ripped me out of sleep. It was so loud and violent that for a second I thought a vehicle had crashed through the woods. A massive cracking, splintering, groaning rupture, followed by a ground-thumping impact that I felt in my ribs. Tree fall. A big one. I sat up instantly. There was no storm, barely any wind. The air outside the tent was dead still, and yet somewhere, in the dark, a tree had just come down, hard enough to shake the ground. I lay there, listening, heart pounding. Nothing. Then, maybe 10 minutes later, it happened again. Different direction, closer, longer. This one sounded less like a trunk naturally giving way and more like something being torn apart under strain. The cracking went on before the final crash hit. Needles drifted down onto my tent roof afterward from whatever canopy had shuddered. Now I was scared. Not panic-stricken, not yet, but scared in the specific way you get when the woods stop behaving like woods and start behaving like a stage where something else has entered. I picked up my rifle and clicked around into the chamber as quietly as I could.
That was when the third sound started. Not a crash, a voice. At least, that's what my brain called it first. It came from downslope, and it was low. Too low, so low I felt it more than heard it. A drawn-out, vibrating groan that rose and fell but never quite broke into anything as recognizable as an animal call. It sounded like a man trying to moan with his mouth full of mud. It lasted for nearly a full minute. I've heard bobcats, bears, coyotes, elk. I've heard foxes scream like women. This wasn't any of them. The sound faded without cutting off, like whatever was making it had turned its head and moved away while still doing it. I did not sleep again. At first light, I packed fast. Then, because fear and pride make a stupid combination, I decided to inspect the site of the second fall before leaving. I wanted proof it had happened, something solid to pin the night on. I found the tree after about 10 minutes of walking through broken brush. It was enormous. Oak, maybe. The trunk lay across the slope, with branches caved into saplings below it. Fresh, pale wood glowed where it had come apart. And it had not fallen naturally. Even now, I can only describe the damage by saying it looked chewed. Not literally tooth-marked in a neat way. It looked worked over, torn open. Long gouges ran through the fracture and down the trunk, some deep enough to sink the length of my finger into. Great strips of bark had been peeled away in wet curls. Fibers of wood hung loose like torn tendon. The base was shredded in multiple directions, as if different forces had yanked and worried it until the thing finally gave. I circled it in disbelief.
Beavers don't do that to standing timber that size. Wind doesn't leave parallel gouges and peeled strips. Human tools would have left cleaner work or obvious cuts. And then I saw my blue bandana. It was lying on the ground near one of the lower branches. Beside it was a carabiner from my pack. Both mine.
I know, because the bandana had a dark bleach spot near one corner from cleaning a battery terminal years earlier, and the carabiner was stamped with my initials from a gear swap at work. My stomach dropped. I dumped my pack right there and started checking pockets. The bandana was gone from the side pouch where I kept it. The carabiner was missing from the accessory loop on my shoulder strap. Something had taken them while I slept. I snatched them off the ground, and that was when I noticed there was something under the bandana. A small bundle of twigs tied with fishing line. At first, I thought it was some backwoods charm or hunter prank. Then I saw what had been lashed into the center of the twigs. A human tooth. Not old, not brown and fossil looking. White. Fresh enough there was still a thread of pink tissue at the root. I dropped the whole thing so hard it bounced. Every hair on my arms came up at once. I backed away from the tree and looked around the woods. Nothing moved. No branches swayed. No bird called. The silence was complete enough to feel manufactured. Then I heard 3 knocks behind me. I spun so fast I nearly fell. The sound had come from the other side of the fallen trunk. 3 evenly spaced impacts, wood on wood. I raised the rifle and took 2 steps backward. Nothing showed itself. I kept backing away until my heel caught a root and I stumbled. My hand went down into leaves and came back wet. Blood. Dark, half-clotted blood soaked through the leaf litter in a long drag mark leading under the trunk. I should have run right then. Instead, I made the mistake of looking. I dropped to a crouch and shined my flashlight under the fallen tree. At first, all I saw was dirt, roots, and shadow. Then a face resolved out of it. A girl, maybe 16 or 17, dead. Her head and one shoulder were visible where the trunk had pinned the rest of her body into the earth. Her eyes were open and full of dirt. One cheek had been torn open against bark or stone, exposing the white edge of teeth. Her lower jaw sat crooked, as if broken. Tangled in the roots beside her hair was a strip of yellow hoodie fabric, slick with dried blood. I jerked backwards so violently, I hit the ground. My beam skittered across the trunk and caught more things wedged under branches above her. Fabric, bones, a boot with a foot still inside it, the pale curved cap of another skull. The tree hadn't fallen on remains. The remains had been arranged under where the tree was meant to come down. The 3 knocks sounded again, this time from much closer. I came up on one knee, with the rifle pointed toward the opposite side of the trunk, just as something rose above it. Not all the way, just enough for me to see the crown of a head, one eye, and fingers hooked over bark. Human fingers. Mud-packed under the nails, skin torn at the knuckles. The eye looking at me was bloodshot and bright with a kind of awful curiosity, as if the person attached to it was more interested in my reaction than worried about the rifle. Then the head dipped out of sight. I ran. No dignity to it, no tactical retreat. I grabbed my pack by one strap and sprinted downhill through brush, crashing branches aside with the rifle in my hands. Every instinct screamed that if I fell, hands would close on my ankles. I heard movement paralleling me through the woods, not charging, keeping pace, sometimes to my left, sometimes right. Too smooth through rough terrain to be another overloaded backpacker. Branches snapped, then silence, then another burst of movement somewhere else, as if there were more than one. I changed direction twice, trying to shake whoever it was. The sounds adjusted. Once I looked back and caught a shape between trees maybe 40 yards away. Tall, thin, not standing straight. It moved with its upper body pitched forward and one arm hanging oddly low, almost to the knee, as if injured or deformed. There was something pale, strapped or tied across its chest that flashed white through the branches. Then it was gone. I pushed harder and made a bad decision, crossing a patch of laurel on a steep side hill. My foot blew out and I went down shoulder first into rocks. The rifle flew from my hands. Pain shot through my collarbone. Before I could get up, something heavy hit the brush 10 feet above me. I saw boots first, mismatched. One hiking boot, one rubber chore boot duct taped at the ankle. Then a hand came through the leaves toward me, not clawing, reaching carefully, almost politely. I scrambled backward and my hand closed on the sidearm at my hip instead of the rifle. I drew and fired once through the brush. The woods exploded. Whoever had been there dropped flat instantly. Not a scream, not a cry, just vanished from the line of sight with shocking speed. Then the undergrowth erupted down slope as something crashed away through laurel like a wounded deer. I grabbed the rifle, regained my feet, and kept moving. The sounds stopped for a while after the shot. That didn't comfort me. It felt like the pause before a different tactic. By early afternoon, I reached a narrow service track cut through the ridge. I followed it, half jogging, until it joined the forest road back toward the trailhead. My truck came into view around a bend like a hallucination. I got in, locked the doors, and only then realized my hands were painted with blood that wasn't all mine. I drove 30 miles before I called the county sheriff. They did not take the call the way I hoped.
Missing person remains under a fallen tree. Possible suspect in the woods. Shots fired. Those are not the kind of words that get shrugged off. But it was still clear from the dispatcher's tone that she had decided early I was either exaggerating or unstable. Deputies met me at a gas station. I gave a statement. They looked at the scrape on my shoulder, my filthy clothes, the blood, the rifle case in the back seat, and asked a lot of practical questions in calm voices. Search teams went in that evening and the next morning. They found the tree. They found remains, plural. More than one set, all in different stages of decomposition. The body I'd seen first belonged to a 17-year-old girl from Tennessee who'd been missing for almost 9 months. The yellow hoodie was in her file. There were others, too, bits of them, enough for separate cases, not all identified. What they did not find was any sign of a living suspect. No camp, no tools, no recent fire site, no blood trail from my shot, no tracks they trusted. There were tracks, I should say, but the area had been disturbed by responders and weather before they could do much with them. A detective asked for every detail about my missing gear and the little twig bundle with the tooth.
They never recovered the bundle. I'd left it by the tree. By the time teams processed the scene, it was gone. That part bothered the detective more than he admitted. The official theory ended up being some kind of lone transient killer or mentally ill squatter operating in the backcountry and using tree fall staging to hide bodies. They asked if the person I saw could have been female, male, old, young, hurt, tall, short. I told them the truth. I had no idea. The woods had shown me pieces, and my own fear had assembled the rest badly. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. About 6 weeks later, I was back in Lexington, sleeping poorly, drinking too much,
jumping at the furnace, kicking on. Every little house noise after midnight made my pulse spike. One rainy night, I heard 3 knocks, not at the front door, at the back slider facing the yard. 3 evenly spaced taps. Glass, not wood. I stood at the end of my hallway with the pistol in my hand and every light in the house off, staring at the dark rectangle of the kitchen where the slider waited. Another 3 knocks. I finally moved forward and hit the kitchen light. No one was outside, but on the concrete patio, centered neatly in the yellow light, was my blue bandana, folded. I opened the door with the gun aimed low and the rain blowing cold into the kitchen. The bandana was clean except for one thing, tied into it with fishing line. Not a twig bundle this time, a small loop of braided yellow sweatshirt string, the same shade as the hoodie pinned under that tree. There was something else under the knot. I leaned closer and nearly dropped to my knees. A strip of human scalp about the width of a finger, dark hair still attached, the underside ragged and gray-white. I didn't touch it. Police came, took photos, collected it. The hair matched nothing in databases they told me about. Maybe because there was nothing to match. Maybe because they stopped looking. You want the worst part? 2 months after that, one detective called me off the record because he thought I had a right to know something. Searchers had found another old tree fall site deeper in the forest, after winter brought down part of a slope. More remains, more staging, more evidence that somebody had been using natural collapses as cover, and nailed to the underside of a root ball where nobody would have seen it unless the earth rolled open was a row of items hung carefully on wire. A child's sneaker, a truck key, a hunting license laminated in plastic, my missing carabiner, and a Polaroid. The photo showed my second campsite on the ridge saddle, taken at night. My tent was in the center of the frame, glowing faintly from moonlight, and in front of it, kneeling so close to the fabric that one hand rested gently against the wall where my head had been sleeping, was a long-armed figure in mismatched boots with something pale strapped across its chest. At first, the detective thought it was a board or piece of plastic. Then he looked closer. It wasn't strapped across the chest. It was hanging from the neck. A child's rib cage, wired together and worn like a bib. I asked him where the Polaroid is now. There was a long pause. Then he said very quietly, "It isn't." I sold the house that summer. I still camp. I still go into forests. But never there, never alone, and never if I wake up in the night and feel that subtle shift in the dark,
like something has stepped into a place where it shouldn't be. Because some killers hide bodies, and some build habits.
And if what was in those Kentucky woods is still alive, then it learned mine well enough to stand outside my home in rain after midnight and knock exactly the same way it knocked on a dead tree before showing me what else it had taken.